Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm Marco Zappa. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Asian and North African Studies at Foscari University of Venice, and I'm co-organizer of this lecture series that we've been holding since November last year on environment, societies, and histories in East Asia. Basically, what we tried to do was to deal with and was to make some fruitful connections with historians dealing with environmental history in East Asia, selecting East Asian countries, especially China and Japan, as their case studies. We have had a few lectures on China, and now today and tomorrow we will have a couple of installments on Japan. We will first start off with Tokugawa, with pre-modern Japan, and as you might see in your screen and in the screen of our guest today, Jakobina from Whitman College, we will dealing with sailing, whaling, and shipwrecks in Tokugawa, Japan, of course. So a few words. First of all, I would like to thank the New Institute for Environmental Humanities that has been supporting our effort in organizing this lecture series. And of course, the Department of Asian and North African Studies at Foscari University of Venice. I would also like to thank our guest, Jakobina Arch. She's associate professor at the Whitman College in the United States. It's very early in the morning for her, so again, many thanks for dedicating a few minutes, well, 1 hour and a half more or less to us. This is very much appreciated, and as I was saying before, of course, given present restrictions still in place, and all the hardships that one might go through, taking an airplane and taking a plane and coming to Italy, we will look forward, of course, to welcoming you one day in person in our department, in our university. As an organizational note, before leaving the floor to Jakobina, our event today will be organized as follows. We will have first presentation by Jakobina. Oh, by the way, Jakobina is also author of an important book on whaling in pre-modern Japan, whose title is Bringing Whales Ashore. She might refer to the book in her presentations too. So after Jakobina's presentation, we will have a discussion that will be started by Davide Zanchettin, who is associate professor at the Department of Environmental and Computer Sciences and Statistics at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. So he's a colleague of ours. And I would like to thank Davide as well, who is busy at a workshop in Firenze. Am I wrong, Davide?
Pisa.
In Pisa, sorry, in Pisa. So thanks to Davide also for taking some time to discuss Jakobina's presentation and bring in some insights from a very different area. Of course, Davide is a physicist, so he might give us some insights, and he did some research, especially on sea currents and am I right? Paleoclimatology, so ancient climates, studies on ancient climates, and the evolutions, especially from physics, from the point of view of physics, which which is, of course, naturally his field of research. So without further ado, I will leave the floor. Jakobina, the floor is yours, and you might take it away whenever you want.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
So I'm going to talk today about a couple of different ways that I'm trying in my work to integrate coastal waters into the history of Tokugawa Japan. This is, in this picture, a kind of prototypical view of historical Japan, right? You have rice farming at the center of everyday life. You've got a nice view of Mount Fuji in the background. But there's something missing from this picture, which is what I want to look at in thinking about what's going on in Tokugawa Japan, or the early modern period in Japan. And that's more visible if you look at these rice paddies, which you'll notice that, yes, rice fields were at the center of many lives in early modern Japan. It was part of the tax system. It was a really important part of organizing things. But a lot of Japan as an archipelago is coastal waters. And so I want to think about not just what's going on in the interior, but also think about what's going on in these waters on the left-hand side of the picture, especially because most histories of Japan, surprisingly, don't really look outside of this rice-centered agricultural society and think about what's going on in the oceans that are all over Japan. So by identifying Japan as just the terrestrial parts of the islands, fisheries end up being a really specialized kind of thing that isn't in general history books. Thinking about what's going on in transportation and other sorts of things gets pushed off to the side. And so I'm trying, along with a few other people more recently, to think about Japan as an archipelago and actually having oceanic space. And what does that do? What does that change in our thoughts about Japan? So as you think about the Tokugawa period, there's a lot of new things that are happening during this period. It's a really exciting time for what some people think of as like proto-industrial developments, things that make it sort of new, but in ways that sometimes lead into modernity and sometimes are its own thing. Some of the things, as you can see in this picture, are the new road system that was set up to integrate connections between the different domains. But the travel part, where a lot of this material is going by ships, is totally left off. So in this picture, the ox carts that you see here have big bundles, which are probably rice bundles, but that's not how most rice was actually shipped. It's much easier to put it on a boat than it is to take it in ox carts or over horses over the steep mountains in Japan. So I'm thinking about, and you do see, if you're looking at woodcut prints, of which there are many beautiful prints from this period, there you can see some ships and some aspects of what's going on in coastal waters, but these are much less common. And so I want to shift our attention to all of these boats that you're seeing here, the fishermen, the other things that are happening in these waters, and to think about including the fishery. So here's advertisement for my book. The picture that got used for the cover is actually one of these woodcut prints that's showing whaling in the Goto Islands in Kyushu. So there are traces of evidence that show that, yes, people are out there on the water, they're doing things there. But if you look at, for example, a textbook that's surveying the period, a lot of this doesn't show up. And so what I'm trying to do in a lot of my work is to shift whatever you might know about Japan. So from something that's just the main islands, so this is Honshu highlighted, right? And Shikoku and Kyushu. And instead of it just being those land masses, also include the coastal waters at the very least that surround and connect them and have people moving through them. Now, during the Tokugawa period, people in Japan were banned by the shogunate from traveling abroad. So it's just these coastal waters. It's not interconnecting with all of East Asia and across the Pacific generally. And they have a very few connections just through Nagasaki and occasional other accidental connections elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that the ocean is totally closed off, right? So this is what I was looking at when I started my research in Japan with whales, and what I'm still looking at now in just different ways, looking at ships and shipwrecks. So this is one thing to think about. This is a sort of typical harbor. This is Kaioi in Yamaguchi Prefecture. which is down in the southwest of Japan. It's not a great harbor, right? They had to build out a huge breakwater to really make it a harbor. This in particular was a space that used to have a whaling group in the Tokugawa. They don't do any whaling there now, but you can also see just how steep the coastline is in a lot of places. There's not a lot of good beach space in a lot of these places. And they're not very bustling areas now, right? You can see a few fishing boats on the wharf here, but it's not the kind of thing that makes you think, oh, there must have been all sorts of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people going out there on the water, because right now there aren't, right? So you have to reimagine how much more busy these places were before. And here's another example. This is the Kumano coast, which is in what is now Wakayama Prefecture, near Osaka. And it's not a very welcoming kind of coastline, right? But a lot of people in this area actually traveled much more by ocean than they did by land, because this mountainous areas, this rocky areas, weren't really great for farming in this particular space. And it was much easier to go on a boat hopping between villages than it was to cross over the mountains. So this is a screen, a folding screen from this period showing that coastline. And you can see how much more of this is water than land, right? People are thinking about the space offshore rather than thinking about the landscape. And a little bit of this picture, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is a whale that's being surrounded by boats. So this is a whaling group hunting whales. There's another little one, a whale tail there. And this is Taiji here, where they're pulling a whale in to process it in this one of these few flat beaches that is mostly in the rest of rocky coastline. And so these places now are in the middle of nowhere. They're off the general travel grid. It's very difficult to get there. So they seem like maybe they would just be marginal fishing villages. You know, people wouldn't necessarily think very much about their importance. And when I was looking at these places, I wanted to see, were they really like that in the Tokugawa, right? When they're connected together more strongly by people who are traveling more in the ocean, how does that change what the impact of these kinds of whaling groups in small villages might have? And also now thinking about the thousands of cargo ships that are going up and down this coast and connecting together ports and these kinds of things. So to start with, here's some examples of things related to whaling. These spaces that were doing whaling, as you could see from the previous picture, they required a coastal station to bring the whales back to process the whales. And so the circles here on the map are places which had been centers of these whaling groups. So starting in number 1 in Ise Mikawa Bay, they moved their way down on those thin lines on the Kumano coast, which is this section 2, and through the inland sea, also over to Tosa. And here's the Goto Islands, where the picture on the cover of my book came from. Here's Kaioi. And you'll notice these spaces here are closely tied to these major currents that come up along Japan's coast. So the Kuroshio and the Tsushima current, which is forks off of the Kuroshio and comes up the other side of Japan, carry a whole bunch of nutrients and also migrating fish and whales. And so the spaces where the whales come close to the shore, where people could go out in small boats and haul them back again, are directly linked into the specific environmental position of Japan with these currents. And you have to think about, why weren't there a lot of whaling groups up here in the early modern period? Well, because the current branches off and the whales migrate further away at that point. And so when I was thinking about how do we deal with understanding the importance of whaling, I was thinking about what the people are doing, but also the environment, about what brings whales close enough for people to be invested in hunting them. How does this work? And unfortunately, we don't actually know that much about the biology of these whales even now, or where they might have migrated. So a lot of the information actually comes from the historical records of the whalers, which is biased definitely for, whales that they wanted to hunt and these kinds of things. But it is useful in thinking about what can we know from people who were observing these animals closely and making use of them. So how did they make use of them? So this is a picture up here of them processing the whales. They entangled them in nets and then harpooned them. So they're taking the net off at this point now that it's up on the beach. And one of the major things that Japanese whaling is known for today is that they eat the whale meat, which a lot of countries don't. And certainly they did that. They processed the meat so that it was sometimes boiled or salted, so it lasts a little longer and it could travel a little further away from the village. But they also processed the blubber and other fatty portions of the whale into oil, which travels much further and can last a year before it starts boiling. And they used other parts of the whales, like the baleen, that in the baleen bearing species, there's toothed whales and baleen whales. And then baleen whales, instead of teeth, they have this keratin, it's sort of fingernail or hair-like substance that is used to filter seawater out and keep the stuff that they're eating inside their mouth when they swallow it. And this is really flexible material. And so it's shaped partially by heat, and it can be used to make all sorts of things. In the West, it was used for boning for corsets and like umbrellas and other things like that. In Japan, it was used as a little folding stools or in springs for puppets and all sorts of interesting little things that spread all over the country. And people wouldn't necessarily know that this came from a whale, but it was parts of whales that were part of the terrestrial life of people even outside of these villages. And they also would boil down and ground down the bones for fertilizer and other sorts of things like that. So they use a lot of different parts of whales, and therefore tracing where those parts go show that whaling impacted a much broader footprint than just the villages that were catching them, which makes sense because whales are really big. So you get a lot of stuff from one whale. You can't consume it all within a village of a couple hundred people. The other thing that I looked at, though, was not just the physical aspects of whales, but also knowledge about whales. Who was thinking about whales? It's not just the people in these villages. There's actually a lot of stories that are published. This is a comic story. This is a person who has a whale for a head because it's one of those sort of fables where the whale is a character, so he has a human body to walk around, but it's like Aesop's stories. And so there's these kind of comic stories. There's stories about merchants who are getting really rich off of whales. And there's also natural history. There's people who are thinking about what are whales? How do you classify them? These anatomical diagrams, how do we understand their biology before it was biological science? So there's a lot of ways in which people at other levels of society and other areas are thinking about what do we do with whales? They impact storytelling and the kind of natural history that becomes biology later. And you have a lot of people actually traveling to these villages to find out more about the whales. Like this picture is one of the things that started me on the project, because I looked at it and said, where does this come from? Who drew this? What's going on? Unfortunately, they didn't sign it, so we don't actually know most of the answers to that. But one of the things is that you can't actually just dissect a whale like you could dissect, a worm or a frog and get this picture of internal organs. It's pulling apart on the beach isn't going to look like this. So somebody had to put a lot of effort into understanding the internal biology of whales to get this kind of picture. And so there's a lot going on with changes in science and the importation of Western anatomical knowledge that's intersecting with this as well. And there's also a lot of religious aspects of how do you deal with killing this very large, impressive creature. The whales actually get treated almost like human spirits once they're dead. They get posthumous Buddhist names in death registers, which is something that you normally only give to people, and only start giving to other beings after whales. So whales were one of the first animals that got folded into this broader understanding of, who is a person and where do you fit on the Buddhist scale of reincarnation and things like that. And this is a ceremony for remembering the deaths of whales in whaling villages. And so people did understand whale spirits as being part of the more nebulous, not really landscape, but metaphysical landscape that humans lived in as well. And so thinking about, how do people deal with other lives in this period, you can look at whales. And partly because they're so big and impressive, they make more of an impact than other animals, which people also might have been thinking about in similar ways. So that's a really quick summary of my entire book. I can expand on many aspects of it if you have questions. But the general conclusion, when I started putting all these different perspectives and tracing where do you find whales and what are people doing with them and thinking about them, I discovered that essentially whales were bringing the marine environment to Japanese people throughout the archipelago, not just the coastal areas, but also inland. And whales are not unique in doing this. It's just that they're very large. So there's many pieces of them that end up in lots of places, more than, say, a sardine. And because they're so large and impressive, they're easier to see the traces of interactions with people. But things like sardines also had some of these same interactions. They were used as fertilizer. There was a whole new specialized fishing industry for them. People were thinking about them differently, right? So you can see different aspects of how harvesting from the ocean was really important in the Tokugawa period, as they kind of ran up against ecological limits with population growth within the agricultural spaces of the archipelago. So the other thing that I started thinking about on top of, okay, there's people harvesting things from the ocean, what else is going on, is thinking about shipping. Right, thinking about how are people moving through the water, not just harvesting from it. What do they think about that space? Is it like a road? Is it, what's going on there? And this is something which is a long-term, will eventually become a book many years from now kind of project. So I'm in the early-ish stages of thinking about it, but I have been looking for different ways to see how can we find out what's going on with these ships over here. This is the Tokaido Road here. At Shinagawa. And so a lot of these stories about travel talk about people traveling along these roads, but they don't really talk about what's going on with the merchants shipping that's right offshore. And so that's the part that I'm thinking about right now. And the one of the best ways to start looking at this is through this really fascinating genre of sort of historical record, sort of literary piece. So these are hyoryuki, these translated as kind of drifting records, but it's castaway records. It's people who were shipwrecked. And when people are shipwrecked, if they drift too far offshore, they've gone outside of where they're supposed to go for like the shogunal law that says Japanese people are not supposed to travel internationally. It's the wrong word, there weren't nations yet, but abroad. And so they had to, if they did make it back to Japan, they had to speak to government officials and explain what had happened and prove that they were not converted Christians who were going to try to convert people, which is one of the reasons for the travel ban, to stop the spread of Christianity from the Catholics who were trying to convert people, the Portuguese and Spanish. And then also they did, the Dutch were Protestant and sort of trying to convert people, but they pretended that they weren't. And so they were allowed to trade in Nagasaki. So there's a big concern about the influence of Christianity. And also just, did you try to go abroad or was it an accident, right? The shipwreck that happened, were you pretending that you shipwrecked and traveled all the way to Mexico and came back, or what's going on? And so we have these records which are formatted like an oral account, just an interview that was written down with these sailors, which is good because these sailors were illiterate. So they don't have their own diaries and stories that I can look at to understand what it was like on these ships. But the reason why we have copies of them now, and there's hundreds of these that still exist today, is because they also circulated both as hand copied manuscripts and also some of them as printed. This one's a printed one, which people just were interested in them as stories, right? They wanted to know what foreign places were like, even if they couldn't travel there. And so they almost became a kind of literature. And they also therefore have a kind of stereotyped process of what happens when you shipwreck. Well, first this happens and then this. And so they're not necessarily perfectly objective accounts of what sailors were thinking. There is a kind of pattern there. But one of the things that I think is that pattern wasn't just a literary kind of trope that, oh, this is how this is supposed to work. It also shaped what people who were sailing expected to happen, right? So if you read all these stories or heard these stories about what it's like when you get in a big storm and your mast snaps off and your rudder snaps off and now it's just a hull floating around, you can't control these big waves trying to swamp the boat. then they're going to do things that in the order that they've heard about them, they're going to expect things to happen a certain way because of these stories. So there's a way in which stories about the ocean are shaping how people are dealing with it in these as well, as you see them kind of over time throughout the period. And so these are the ships that I'm looking at. They're known as Bezaisen, sometimes as Sengoku Bune and Sengoku Bune, not the Sengoku Warring States period. That's a different character. This is 1,000 koku, and the koku being the rice measure. So it's a measure of how much cargo they could carry, although it wasn't exactly 1,000. That's kind of a general term. They were actually 500 koku early in the period in the mid 17th century. And by the end of the 19th century, many of them were 2,000 or 2,500 koku. I forget the conversion to tonnage, but it doesn't, you just can kind of think about they're getting bigger. And these ships, as you can see for scale on the person size here, they were fairly large. They got larger over the course of the period. And they're a new design that shows up during the Tokugawa period. So they're not something, they used to have things like the red steel ships that were trading with China. The design was different. So there's something going on here which is adapted specifically to the fact that they're only traveling in coastal waters. And there's thousands of these operating during the period. And one of the things that you can maybe see in this picture is they have these flat, they're not rounded hulls. There's these flat panels that make them up. And each of these is made up of lots of different pieces of lumber. So you don't just have one long plank that goes around the edge of the hull. You actually have lots of pieces that you kind of make a puzzle piece to make a flat plank. And so you can use lots of different scraps of wood. You don't need really specific shapes like you do with European ships with ribs, where they're looking for a tree that's shaped very particularly to go around this corner, things like that. You can just pull together lots of different pieces of lumber and make a functional ship out of it. And similarly, the masts were bundles of sticks. They weren't one long tree. And so one of the things that's happening is there's a big lumber shortage in especially the early Tokugawa period, as they're building the city of Edo, which was a fishing village before, as they're building castle towns, and then they burn because they're all wooden, and so there's lots of fires, and so they're rebuilding all these places, and so there's a shortage of good timber available, and yet there's thousands of these new ships that are being built just for coastal trade. And so they make these kinds of adaptations to deal with the constraints of both the spaces that they're sailing in and the kind of materials they have available to them. And you can see here, there's these cargo ships are anchored here outside of Edo. And there's also ones on the horizon. There's a whole bunch of them coming in. These little tiny sails in the background is often where you see ships. And I've gotten really good at finding ships in tiny little corners in the background and not really talked about. But what happens is they come in and they're too big to get into the rivers that are the center of big ports like Edo and Osaka. And so they anchor out in the outer harbor, and they have little boats like these ones come out and take the cargo off and bring them into the rivers and put them in the warehouses. And so one reason why maybe we don't have people noticing as much and talking about these cargo ships is because they're not directly inside the lives of people in the city. They're a little bit offshore, right? You see them as you're going by on the road. You see them out there in the harbor, but they're not in a port against the wharves and having lots of people there, right? All the material is coming in on smaller boats. And so that's one thing that I think is happening with them not showing up as much in ordinary people's stories about like what the waterfront looks like in Edo or Osaka, where many of these ships are. And just to go back to some of the adaptations that are going on in these ships. So here's, the pine torches that they were using for lighting in this period are bundles of pine twigs. And the mast is very similar design. They're not as small a piece of wood, but you can use really thin young trees and bundle them together and have one mast. And so they don't need the same kind of forests as, for example, the British Empire was going all over the world looking for specific kinds of straight trees, and they would mark them off for the Navy. You can use lots of different things for these. There's also, this is maybe a better picture of the way that the hull is flat pieces joined together. And it's mostly flat bottom. And so this allows them to go into really shallow water, which most of the harbors in Japan are, because they're rivers, river deltas, right? And the rivers in Japan have a lot of sediment because the landscape is so steep that the rains wash a lot of sediment down. The rainy season, when you get typhoons and everything coming through, tends to wash a lot of sediment down. And so the harbors tend to silt up really rapidly, and they have to dredge them to even get these shallow ships in, which are about maybe 4 meters deep. So really not very deep in comparison to the kind of cargo ships that are operating, that are going, say, from the Netherlands or elsewhere. But even so, they're not shallow enough to get in some places. And so they also have this rudder at the back. As you can maybe see, the diagram's a little faint. The rudder pivots up so that the part that's hanging down lower than the bottom of the ship, which gives it a little bit of stability when they're sailing, they can pull up and go in even closer to shore. But in order to do that, you have to have an open transom, open back end of the ship to let the rudder go up into it. And one of the things that outside observers is there were some Europeans who had come in at different scattered moments trading through Nagasaki in the course of the period, and they're looking at these ships and they're saying, oh, these are built poorly so that they will not be able to go offshore because people are not allowed to sail in the open Pacific, which doesn't make sense to me at all, because why would you spend a lot of money and time? It takes about a year to build these things, building a ship that's broken on purpose, right? And so instead, yes, if there are big waves, they can come in the open back of the ship. And that is a problem. And this is where you get some of the shipwrecks. But these are actually adaptations to very specific types of problems in sailing in shallow waters and being able to get into all these little ports, and that they make sense if you expect not to have to go offshore where the bigger waves would be that might come in the back of your ship. So that's one of the things that I've been looking at and thinking about, where are people going? They're going within sight of land. They're going in a distance where you can go into port at night, right? They're only by the 19th century are they doing multi-day trips, right? So they're really not worried about being seaworthy out in the open ocean, even if Europeans thought that they should have been. And so coastal trade was operating along these very specific routes. You can see on the map here that were established. The shogunal government actually hired somebody to survey what are the safest routes to send the tax rice shipments from domains that are all over Japan to Osaka and Edo, where they can get converted into all of the things that they use the taxes for, including paying samurai stipends and converting them into cash that you can pay for all sorts of, silk and food and housing and other things. And so they set up these very specific, here's the ports where you're supposed to stop, here's the safe routes to go. And once they'd set that up for taxes and for official shipping, merchants now knew where they could go safely and could use them for their own. And so there was an explosion of coastal shipping once people figured out ways to sail along the coast, not just within the inland sea, which had a lot of traffic before because it's much more sheltered than, as you can see, any other place here where you have the open Pacific, huge amount of wind and waves can come and crash across the Pacific with no barriers. And on the Japan seaside, in the wintertime, the prevailing winds come across Siberia and mostly don't hit anything until they hit the Japan Alps. And so again, not really great for stormy weather on the water. And so people didn't really sail in the wintertime, but even outside of the wintertime, they were very careful to try to sail where they could go quickly back into a port and shelter there and wait out the bad weather. And so the fact that some of the design of the ships wasn't as seaworthy in high waves just meant you didn't sail in high waves. And so there were ways that people had figured out how to make use of these spaces, and the fact that coastal Japan's not very sheltered. It's not really a great place to go sailing. Even now, there's not many people who want to be operating in these waters. And yet it offers a lot more than trying to load everything up onto horses or ox carts and try to get them over really steep mountains. So one of the things that I'm thinking about with this project, and I'm still figuring out how to answer, is what do the sailors actually tell us in, for example, those oral interviews that get written down? How much do we trust those as real sailors' experiences? How much do we see things that might be somebody who's a government official who's never been on a boat experiencing, interpreting what's going on? But there's also things like, these are all picture of Emma or prayer images. They're donated to a temple or a shrine as part of hoping for safety. As you can see, most of them look like this one or this one. They're usually showing them sailing relatively safely, but some of them do show the process of a shipwreck. And probably once they'd survived, they would donate saying, thank you for saving us from this shipwreck that happened to us. But there's different ways that people think about this space and how safe it is, and how do you manage risk, both in designing a particular kind of ship, in designing the kind of routes that you go along and the timing of how you use that space, but also in what kinds of forces you think you're dealing with, right? What kinds of influence you might have over those forces. If you ask really nicely, or if you give them the right kind of gifts, will the Dragon King under the sea stop making terrible tides, or will a particular bodhisattva or kami save you from some other kind of problem? And so there's ways in which looking at these traces of what sailors have left behind, what merchants have left behind, can tell us something about what might have been what the sailors were thinking, even though they're not literate and telling us directly. And also there have been 4 reconstructions done from the 1990s through the early 2000s. A ship carpenter who had been making fishing vessels, but he had apprenticed to, I think his grandfather or his great-grandfather had built these kinds of ships in the Tokugawa period, and he had been, making boats. His whole family had been making them, but they've been becoming smaller fishing boats. And he just, as a curiosity, decided he wanted to build one for the first one. And then other historians and other people got really excited and said, oh, how can we figure out how to make this as accurate as possible? And then they got to test sail them and answer some questions about how well did they sail and other things like that. And so we do have some information from these ship reconstructions, which also help us think about, well, if this was our experience in the modern era, trying to adapt to these ships, what might it have been like when these were the only kind of ship people were used to? And so some of the reconstruction stuff was not, they had to adapt things. They had a Coast Guard vessel next to them to save them in case they did something wrong. It wasn't entirely the same experience, but we can extrapolate a little bit about the kinds of problems that they were dealing with and the ways that they solved them by looking at these reconstructions. So I am just going to stop there to leave lots of time for questions and comments, but I am happy to expand on any of these. I know I just threw a whole bunch of different things at you at once, but the general idea that I'm working with is that the coastal waters of Japan were really important to a lot of people, and they're surprisingly missing from a lot of histories. And I'm hoping to get that back in by thinking about this environment as connected to the rest of Japan. It's part of Japan. So I will stop sharing so I can see people's faces, and well, there we go.
Thank you so much, Jakobina. I think you already made the point in your book, and I wish you all the best for this coming book, of course, on more focused, I guess, on sailing. I will leave the floor to Davide Zanchettin.
Okay, thank you, Marco. Thank you, Jakobina, first of all, for the nice presentation. So I prepared a few slides, if I can share my screen. Okay, let me see.
Yes, you should be able to do that.
Okay. Which was actually built up based on your Bringing Whales Ashore book and my reading of it. And so maybe it's not really targeted to your presentation, but let's see if there is food for thought enough for us. Okay, let's see. Okay, so first of all, I would like to speak a little bit from a natural science perspective about one of these non-protagonist actors of your talk, which is the Kuroshio current. And it's a western boundary current, one of the most powerful currents that we see in the world ocean. So I have an animation here that shows the ocean, the surface ocean circulation based on satellite data. So satellite since the late 70s allow us to have a very detailed view of what's going on in the ocean, okay, even far away from the coast. And there are so many features that we can see in this type of data, okay, and especially in a visualization like this one. And you see the western boundary current of the North Pacific here. Possibly you can see my arrow also going around. So this is the Kuroshio basically going up, and then we have the Kuroshio-Yasho extension, okay, going basically zonally or horizontally in your screen towards the North American coast. Basically, the Kuroshio is the analog of the Gulf Stream, okay, to the other side. So it has a similar shape, okay, and as you see, when we think about Kuroshio, we think about a very strong current, and in fact it is, because the speed of the current may be exceeding 2 meters per second, so very, very strong current. But in fact, as you see, it is not just one uniform flow going from south to north along the continent, more or less, but in fact it is peppered by, in this figure, by red and blue dots. So these are mesoscale gyres, okay, these eddies, these vortices, okay, that are transported and actually make up the Kuroshio. And the Kuroshio, we don't think about it anymore. There is evidence of it, about a kind of a stationary phenomenon, so something that is invariant. It is characterized by substantial variability. By the way, the western boundary currents, so the Kuroshio, like the Gulf Stream, are one of the proofs that Earth is not a flat land, but okay, something different. So let me go on, because we don't have to think about the Kuroshio being something always the same. Okay, it is true. It moves along the eastern coast of the Pacific, of the Japan, but as you see here, it is known to actually be affected by a B-stability or B-modality. So there are two states upon which we can observe the Kuroshio. So one that is more straight or non-large meander path, and another state where there is a stronger meandering of the current. Okay, and this is illustrated in a paper of 2009. But you see from one of the publications that I put a look on for this presentation, it's already since the 70s that it was clear that the Kuroshio had the possibility to display different trajectory, one with meandering and one with a more straight path. Of course, this affects all the environmental conditions upon which living beings strive in the ocean, but also about humans. There is evidence nowadays about the fact that during times when there is a strong meander, climate in Tokyo, for example, is different from times when there is not a strong meandering of the Kuroshio. Okay, just because you can imagine the warm water is shifted more towards east, and then it goes back towards regions closer to the equator, where they can further warm up and be then a stronger source of moisture. Okay, affecting then through the greenhouse effect, but also providing source for precipitation in the regions surrounding it. So there is variability, okay, and this variability seems to occur on timescales that may be of a few years and to 10 years or so. So there is decadal variability, as we call it. Also, there is the Kuroshio paradox, because it is true that the Kuroshio is kind of one of the arteries of life, okay, because it is known there are many fishes and marine mammals that live along the currents and are transported by the current, but in fact it is oligotrophic, so it is full of nutrients. And this is kind of a paradox, because a lot of life, but not enough nutrients to support the life. And this is explained by possibly a large amount of nutrients below the Kuroshio, okay? That is a source then for the animals that strive on the more near to the surface. And then about variability. So Kuroshio displays variability on decadal timescales, and maybe we can link that to some extent to one of the best known modes or most debated modes of climate variability that we can observe on our Earth. It is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It has a pattern that in the sea surface temperature looks like this. Okay, so it consists of cold temperature anomalies, okay, the blue blob along the Kuroshio-Yasho extension mostly, and surrounded basically by a horseshoe of warm anomalies. So if we just take this pattern and look how this pattern gets enhanced or even reversed, we obtain a time series, an index, the PDO index, that, as you see, seems to shift in historical times between warm phases, positive phases, the red part on the bottom figure, and cold phases, okay? And I really like the PDO in this context because we were trying to link always natural science understanding of climate physics and also the human dimension with the environmental dimension in between. So we have spoken about whaling, but in fact, the PDO became known, okay, broadly to the scientific community by this paper, actually called, or referring to interdecadal climate oscillation, okay? But the key point was that one of the elements that was brought forward in this paper was the variability that was observed in salmon production along the Alaskan coast, if I remember correctly, associated to this mode. And this is the type of record that is present in this paper. So all these kind of reports about salmon production changing a long time and identifying then warm and cold PDO phases. But then the book speaks about the Tokugawa period. So historically, I don't know much about it, but it was apparently a peace period, okay, so with a strong development. What was the climate scene where we have the Tokugawa period? It's from the early 17th century, okay, 1603, something like that, to something past the mid-19th century, 1868, if I remember the number. So we are at the core and at the tail of the Little Ice Age, a known relatively cold period, okay, at least in various parts of the Northern Hemisphere continents. So this is illustrated in this diagram here, where you see climate reconstructions. So one source of information of past climate evolution. And you see there is clearly some cold or negative temperature anomalies during this period, around 1600 to the mid 1850s. So maybe there is a connection. Maybe this was relevant for the Tokugawa period, for its establishment, for its duration. Maybe not. This is a matter of debate. But in fact, there is a coincidence between two facts. Okay, and this is one of the examples portrayed about how the human dimension have been affected broadly by the Little Ice Age and these very, very strong and long winters. So this is one of the many paintings by Peter Bruegel the Elder from the Netherlands, depicting winter scenes where there is always snow and a lot of snow, okay? So then volcanoes, because when we think about what caused the Little Ice Age, so set the scene for the Tokugawa period, we have to speak about the forcing agents that acted upon the climate of the time. And most of the scientific debate nowadays goes around the role of volcanoes. Okay, volcanoes are known to be capable of influencing the climate substantially. So very strong eruption eject a lot of stuff in the atmosphere. Part of it is made of sulfur gases. These gases, if the eruption is strong, they can penetrate high up in the atmosphere, and then they are converted in aerosols, sulfuric aerosols. They stay in the upper atmosphere for maybe a couple of years or so, and they create kind of a veil that kind of masks or reflects, in fact, solar radiation back to space. The result is surface cooling, okay? If we see here, this is a reconstruction of volcanic history. Just don't think about the different colors, only focus on the fact that longer bars imply stronger eruptions. And you see, we are here in our recent times. The strongest eruption is the Pinatubo eruption, 1991, okay? If we go back in the course of the last millennium, we see many eruptions that were much, much stronger than Pinatubo, okay? Then capable of influencing climate. And in fact, there are hypotheses about this series of strong eruptions possibly contributing to the establishment exactly of the Little Ice Age. 1600 is around here, okay? So the Tokugawa period starts around here, and we have a couple of eruptions, okay, here, which in fact are part of a cluster that we are, from a paleoclimate perspective, very much interested in. And this eruption here, the strongest one, is in year 1600, is the Huayna Putina eruption in Peru. So the strongest eruption in the Andes in historical times. So why I tell all this story? Because recently I was involved in a study led by a historian, which is Sam White. I think this is one of the first times that climate modelers, paleoclimatologists interested in climate reconstructions, environmental scientists, and paleoclimatologists get together and try to bring each own's expertise in order to solve a dilemma. Because we found in a number of simulations the possibility that the Huayna Putina triggered a regime shift, so a change in the state of North Atlantic climate from very sudden, so in the matter of a few years, from a warmer state to a colder state. We didn't find much evidence of this shift in reconstructions, so from proxies, okay? So our other traditional source of information. And therefore, with Sam, who led this paper, we decided to look at documental archives, so to look at what humans told about this period, focusing, of course, on the North Atlantic. And I see a connection with the Jakobina work because one of the sources of information was information about expedition going for walrus hunting and whale hunting to Bjørnøya, so the Bear Island, an island in between Spitsbergen and Norway, and Spitsbergen itself. So by just looking at these records about when these ships were able to sail off from the coast, we said, okay, it was frozen, not frozen, so colder, warmer than normal. So this provided for us qualitative yet valuable information. Another source of information was using voyage journal and ship logs of European voyages that at the time were kind of aiming at exploring the Arctic. So again, seeing how far north these ships were able to go year after year allowed us to reconstruct qualitatively still sea ice extent in the North Atlantic, and therefore try to link with the possibility that the climate was indeed or has shifted to a colder state all of a sudden around the Huayna Putina eruption. So the conclusions of our study at the time is that it is inconclusive, unfortunately. So we didn't pinpoint, we didn't realize what happened really. So the pieces do not match. Of course, it's not precise information, okay? Not from the model, not from the reconstruction, not for documental archives. But I think the paper is published, and I think it is important as still as an attempt, because it shows the potential of historical climatology to reconstruct highly resolve local climatic and environmental conditions that are relevant to studies of model-derived mechanisms. So we can really move forward in using historical archives to support paleoclimatic and paleoclimate modeling, especially studies. I would like to conclude with by reading something, because I was, as some of you already heard, at a workshop bringing together again historian, paleoclimatologists, environmental scientists, and there was this slide shown earlier today by Scott Mensing, and yeah, I would like to finish my contribution by reading it. So, in trying to join our research, we do not need to match our data to be a perfect fit. What is more important is to identify an area where your evidence might be complementary and spur us to think differently or more deeply about human and climatic impacts on the environment. Jointly, we may be able to identify new approaches to what might otherwise be an intractable problem. The goal is to try to have both voices together, to humanize the scientific evidence and to provide physical evidence for the human dimension. So, therefore, I would like to conclude with the idea that we really need natural science and human science, the humanities, to talk more and maybe to find some scientific questions or intriguing questions only that we would like to pursue together and try to find an answer to. Thank you.
Thank you, Davide. I think you dropped so much food for thought for everyone.
Sorry, maybe it was too long, but
no, it's totally fine. I'm actually curious to hear Jakobina's insights on this, and if she might have come across, what also data in her reading of her accounts on shipwrecks, and of course also in her analyzing and researching materials on whaling in the Tokugawa, in late Tokugawa especially, if she came across, climate data or some sort of information related to what Davide was saying. Oh, before that, I'm seeing Francesca also in the screen, Francesca Tarocco, who is the chair of the new Institute for Environmental Humanities, which has supported this lecture series. So again, thank you to the Niche, and Francesca, if you want to say something, please feel free to do so.
Yes, sorry, I was in a previous meeting. Jakobina, thank you so much for your talk, which I enjoyed a lot. And yes, just very quickly, we are a new institute here at Foscari, University of Venice, and we deal with the environmental humanities, but indeed, we are very open to collaborations with scientists and people outside the humanities, so environmental studies in a sense. But yes, so this is our first really experiment with a series of critical environmental humanities in Asia, in East Asia. And yeah, we're very grateful for your contributions today, and we hope to do more in the future. Really, I think we are, a cluster of really very committed and engaged scholars here at Foscari, and we hope to continue the conversation with all of you. But I have a few questions myself, but please, before that, go ahead with your discussion. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you. So,
yeah, just to respond to the, there's a couple of different points of information that I think do connect really well to what I was working on. In looking at whaling, obviously there are changes in whale availability, which may reflect migration shifts, which may reflect climate shifts, but because we have so little information about their migration patterns, it's really hard to parse out, oh, this means that this is because of climate and this is because of something else. This is because the whalers are giving too much pressure on this particular route, So I do think that in that case, it would be very hard to match exactly what's going on. But I do think more broadly, one of the reasons why during the Tokugawa, people did end up relying much more heavily on fisheries was related to the Little Ice Age, right? That they did have population growth up through about the mid 18th century, and then it leveled off. And there's a lot of debates about what was controlling that leveling, and was it difficult conditions and famines, or was it people's choices? And I won't get into too much of that, but there clearly was a sign from my perspective as an environmental historian that they were reaching carrying capacity on agriculture, right? That they were pushing out into much more marginal areas of agriculture, which are much more vulnerable to cold, especially, right? Like Tohoku, if you don't have just the right kind of warm weather in the summertime, you don't get a harvest, right? The length of the season as you go that far north is just too marginal. And they were not just trying to do more growing of rice up there, they also were trying to push up into the mountains, which similarly has more climate related problems of getting colder and having problems with a more tropical crop like rice. And so I think that while one of the things that people have talked about for agriculture is that, you know, they're making the most use out of their landscape, and some of it they've had to kind of spill over into fisheries because they have more people, I think also they have to spill over into fisheries and supplement because the agriculture is less reliable in the Little Ice Age. Right. I mean, that's not something that I have direct information on, but I do think that that makes sense of some of the shift to specialized fisheries for herring and whales and salmon and other sorts of things, right? That they have the difficulties with farming have caused some of that. And I also think that the climate is very important in thinking about shipping. I haven't had a chance to look into that as closely yet because this is a newer project, but obviously, I mean, ships, these are sailing ships. They rely on a certain wind pattern. They rely on certain conditions. And when I first started looking into the shipwrecks, so I found these shipwreck records related to, because one of the whalers I was looking at was picked up there was a fisherman who was picked up by American whalers. So I was, you know, thinking about whaling related stuff and thinking, oh, the shipwrecks are intersecting. And then I found these records. Oh, these are fascinating. But I thought that they were going to be things like typhoons, right? That it was going to be the kinds of big storms that are much less regular and are, you know, huge problems, but not that frequent, relatively speaking. But it turns out that most of these wrecks happen in more regular weather, I guess you could say, right? That there are storm patterns that go regularly through over the course of a season that catch people who were too far away from a port when the weather shifted. Usually these stories talk about, because they're not sailing in the winter, there's a winter pattern of just about weekly storms coming across Siberia that are, you know, northeast winds that are terrible high waves, and then it dies down a little bit and then it comes back again. But in the rest of the season, when mostly these ships are operating, there also seems to be a fairly regular pattern, which I don't know as much about yet, but I will definitely be looking into some climatology more deeply, where they talk about the wind changing to a and I'm not sure the best way to translate this, but essentially, literally, it's a large west wind, like a great west wind, right? So it shifts westerly or southwesterly, and that's not useful for both the amount of waves that they're getting, but also the directions that they're trying to sail in. And so definitely climate and both broad patterns and more local, you know, decadal type of patterns have a huge influence on what I will be looking at. It's not just the water, it's also the winds and the intersections between currents and wind and temperature and all these other things. So I do hope to be able to get into some of that. I've just so far done a very little bit of research on what's been published on what are the prevailing wind patterns and things like monsoon patterns. So I'm not sure how much is out there, but it's very interesting to think about, especially with the Little Ice Age on top of it, right? That you can't just use the patterns that we've measured today to say, oh, it would definitely be like this in the Tokugawa, because it probably would be different, right? So.
Thank you so much. I think you might ask David as well.
Well, yeah.
Reading suggestions.
There is a lot that we're discussing about. Yes.
Thanks a lot. Jakobina, I would have before, the Q&A session, the open Q&A session, I would ask you, because I thought, when I first read your book, I immediately related to what one Japanese historian, Amino Yoshihiko, told about, the maritime view of the archipelago. And I think the first chapter, especially of your book, like the the archipelago that deals with the archipelago as seen from a whale's eye, was much, talking to that in conversation with that. But on the other hand, as you mentioned in your at the beginning of your presentation, it's always difficult to find, that maritime view represented in history of Japan as if Japan wasn't like an archipelago somehow, or a series of islands. So what's your take on this? Why do you think it's so difficult to integrate the sea into Japanese history, and why it's so difficult for Japanologists or Japan historians, to see the sea and the ocean, which is not that small,
right there,
actually.
Yeah, well, and Amino Yoshihiko is one of the few people who really did say, oh wait, we should be looking at more maritime aspects of history. And he was focused more in his own work on medieval history. So the time period that he and his students were really looking at was before the time period that I'm looking at. So when there is information, it doesn't quite get into the Tokugawa. And so I think one of the things that happens, I mean, obviously there's a broader question about across all of Japanese history, why are we not looking at this? Which I'll get to in a second. But for the Tokugawa, there's an additional layer which has caused people to not think about it because the shogunate restricted travel across the ocean. So that somehow translates into people assuming that there's no ocean involved, right? That they forget about the coastal movements and operation in those waters and just say, well, they didn't have ships that could cross the Pacific or go to China on their own. And so we can ignore it, which is, doesn't really work, but there is a really strong influence there, I think. More broadly, I think one of the reasons why people haven't thought about the oceans as much is because the way that history was written when they started writing historical records, when they started writing in Japan, they imported both the writing system and the framework for what you write about, and the government and everything else from China. And China's model is the rice farmer at the center, providing resources for the ruling scholarly class, right? And the ratio of coastline to land in China is very different than in Japan, right? There is much less proportional coastline for China to worry about. And historically, there have been phases where it mattered more and less, but I think just there's a very ingrained perspective of organizing your descriptions of society and what's important and what the domains are worried about and all these sorts of things on a very terrestrial perspective. And it's taken a long time for people to even notice that. I mean, that's one of the things that Amino was like, oh, wait, we're thinking about hyakusho, which is translated sometimes as peasant and sometimes as farmer directly. And we're in Japan today, when people see that word, they think farmer, right? They think it's the same thing as a farmer, but it really is much more closely a peasant who could be a fisherman, who could be doing other things, right? It's just a commoner, right? And so that trend of assuming that when you see an ordinary person, that they're a farmer has clearly, it's been embedded in the kinds of records that are important. So they talk about a village, they talk about it as a hyakusho village. Somebody 100, 200, 300 years later says, oh, that's a farming village, and forgets to check whether they're mostly fishing, right? And so there's ways in which that original structure of perspective on what kind of records you make has really shaped Japan because it's coming from the outside, I think. Of course, it's been in place for so long that you think, well, but they've been living in this archipelago. Wouldn't they have noticed that you also need to talk about what's going on with fishermen or with piracy or with shipping or other things? And so I don't think that's entirely the excuse, but I do think that it's a real strong influence. And I do think that there's also now, if you're thinking about more modern historians thinking back on what was important, there's the problem that oceans are much less visible to most people today than they used to be in the 19th century and earlier, because I've seen maps of cargo shipping today, that the vast amount of what gets shipped today is on cargo ships. Shipping traffic is larger than it's ever been, all this sort of stuff, but most people don't know that, right? They don't see it, and the number of people who work on the water is much smaller because a lot more of this is automated. Those huge cargo ships have tiny crews in comparison to the number of people who would have been required to ship that much stuff previously. And so you don't have the same amount of port workers, the longshoremen or other people unloading the ships. Like you've got cranes unloading, you have one person running it. And so the proportion of the population who works directly or indirectly with ocean related stuff is much smaller. So we don't notice the importance of the ocean in the stuff that's happening now. And so we don't think about what that would look like in the past either, right? And so the pictures that I showed of, what did the coast look like? I went to the Kumano coast and I looked out there and I didn't even see any fishing boats. Like the waters were empty of boats, which is not something I'm used to in the coasts in North America. It's like, wait, what's happening? But this is what people see now. And so they don't mentally populate that seascape with all the ships that should have been there. They don't think about, wait a minute, where are all the fishermen? You hear news about, well, fishing is collapsing and there's a problem, but a lot of Japanese fishing is not coastal. They've lost all the fish in the coastal waters. So they're offshore so far that nobody sees them. They don't think about them. They come home and I guess that's just their job and you don't think about it. So I think there's a layer of sort of the way that people do records in Japan and what their focus is supposed to be for important things coming from the Chinese model of terrestrial agriculture. There's the additional layer in the Tokugawa of just assuming that the ocean was unimportant because the shogunate was ignoring it. And then there's the layer of modern perspectives, not including enough of the ocean. And I think this has always surprised me because I grew up on the ocean. I grew up in New England. We went sailing every summer. Like I assumed that everybody just, did stuff with boats. And the more I talk to people, like people are fascinated by this, but don't have that experience. So it wouldn't have occurred to them to look at these woodcut prints and say, why is there only a tiny little boat? What is this? Who are those people on those boats? And so I think you need more effort to look for it now. And that's been holding people back from realizing how important it could have been at different periods.
Thanks a lot. This is fascinating, actually. We actually don't see the importance of the sea and sea routes, especially as far as world trade, global trade is concerned, unless we have to face supply chains disruptions and so on and so forth.
The ship stuck in the Suez Canal.
Ships getting stuck in Shanghai or other major ports around the world. But thanks also for these comments, Jakobina. And I will, if there are questions, of course, please, the audience can feel free to chime in and ask directly our guest speaker. Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, please, Francesca, and then I will take Sonia. I think Sonia is traveling, so she cannot actually speak.
Right,
but I will read the question here. or Jakobina will you?
Yes, I have two questions really. One is, are there records? I'm sorry, I'm a sinologist. So are there records or ways to how did people think about the climate? Did they, of course they did, but was there a sense that people were recording, how do we what are the type of materials, historical and otherwise, visual materials, or that we can harness in Japan, I guess in the Tokugawa period or earlier, to see how people, recorded climate change?
There are some people who've started to look into this, including there's one really great study that has looked at Lake Biwa, and there's a tradition of diaries from people in Kyoto who record when the ice forms on Lake Biwa, and they record when the cherry blossoms come out. And so there are people who've looked into translating that into climate patterns. Those are mostly for earlier than the Tokugawa, because that's a court tradition in like the Heian period and around then. So there are certainly within the literary tradition, the inclusion, the expected inclusion of natural features can be used to kind of see, well, are we shifting to which type of seasonal poetry, and things like that, comments on, oh, it's springtime and we would expect this flower, but we're getting this, that you could look into. There's also and one of the things that got me interested in the shipwrecks is like, where in there can we see kind of general commentary about climate. I know some of them do talk about very specific things, like the water turned a greener color and the sky was very ominous, and this showed us that a storm was coming. That I think could potentially, if you could pull those together in a broader comparison, could think about, okay, when was that? Is this only happening in the fall when you're starting to get winter storms coming in, or is this something that's, a typhoon coming, or things like that? But it is, I think, very scattered. I think we don't really have the same thing as the gazetteers in China, where know that there's definitely reporting on crop failures and ice and other things. And there may be some people in individual domains who have that kind of record, but it's not as widespread, and it's not as obvious where you would find it. So I think it requires a little bit more digging to get at, but I think there might be some information to work with in literature and art. Yeah.
Very interesting. And the other question, if I may, is I'm fascinated about what you said about whales being there as part of the, I guess, seascape cosmology, the human non-human relationship. I mean, what are the sources for that?
So I've just kind of found lots of different scattered things that I had to pull together. So there's a couple of written sources that are descriptions of whaling groups by scholars who live there. And one of them is by a monk at the local temple who is kind of saying, here's what the group thinks, and here's the kinds of problems that is, and these kinds of things. And so some of those...
A Buddhist monk.
Yeah.
A Buddhist monk, yeah. Temple records.
Yeah, so there's some of that's sort of temple records. There's some remaining business records from the whaling groups, but those are pretty scattered, and a lot of them, like one of the longest running whaling groups in Taiji, their business records burned in a warehouse fire in the 19th century. So like the whole collected amount is like, oh no, it doesn't exist. So they're really, there's little mentions. There's petitions from groups to their local domain lord, which show up in the prefectural histories. There's monuments. There's just not a lot of information carved on the stone, but some dates, and you kind of extrapolate, okay, what was that for, and try to see if there's any kind of things there. So there's things like the anatomical scroll that, they're clearly, some of those are really expensive looking, very high quality artwork. And so I assume that they were, at least those copies were commissioned by a daimyo or something like that, but they don't have signatures, they don't say the reason why we're collecting this information is this person. So a lot of it is kind of interpreting between these scattered references and trying to see what bigger picture comes out of it. So it's a lot of puzzle pieces.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And for Sonia's question,
for Sonia, thanks.
Maps are great, and I definitely am going to be trying to look at maps as part of this project, especially since there's what has been written about the mapping and understanding coastal space in Japan has mostly relied on maps that are not of the sea route. So this one that you show is like unusual and really great, and I'm definitely going to be using that and whatever other ones with actual sea routes on them. I found a couple of other ones that generally the sea route ones are separate from the sort of inland scholars thinking about geography, right? And so you see maps of the Tokaido or the other kinds of roads, and they don't also connect into travel on the water as much, right? And so they seem to be kind of separate perspectives. And there's much more of those kinds than there are the ones that show the coastal routes. But I do think that that's more of a kind of genre shift, like that there are multiple sorts of people making maps. It's not because nobody is thinking about this geographic space, it's that different people are thinking about geography differently, right? And so maps are created for different reasons, and most of the ones that we have are ones that are not created for understanding how people are using coastal space. They're created for the domain, showing off what resources it has or other things like that. And so I do think that there are a lot of things that we can get out of them, even if they don't have sea routes on them, to tell us more about how that space really is part of the rest of Japan, even if the map maker doesn't make it as obvious as we would like. So thank you for that link, though. I hadn't seen that particular catalog one. That'll be very useful.
Yeah, that's something, if I can add something, so that's something Sonia has been working on in the last 3 years, I guess. So, I mean, then I might put you in touch if you'd like. So, are there other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
If I may.
Yeah.
I'm a master's student in environmental humanities, and I'm also from Japan. So it was very interesting to hear all these fascinating lectures, and thank you very much. And I have 2 questions for you, if you could kindly answer. I'm kind of putting a little research for anthropology class about whale hunting in Japan. And I found this tribe in Indonesia, in a little island called La Malera, I think. And they also do like whale hunting as well, like in the same exact way that we did a long time ago. And I was wondering if you know any other tribe or any people that does the same, that has the same whale culture, whale hunting culture. And another question is, I was wondering why we don't have this connection with whales anymore in Japan. Thank you.
No, that's a good question. So there are other places that do coastal whaling. It's a bit different, the sort of materials that they use, and very few people ever developed that kind of entanglement in nets. But the Macaw tribe in the Pacific Northwest have a very strong whale culture, and Joshua Reed has written a book about that that gets into the whaling culture. It's the title something like "The Sea Is My Country," and there are also there are some people who do whaling in the Caribbean, but it's I think much more modern. It's kind of happened after the American whalers stopped there and they learned from them. So I don't know how traditional that is in comparison to these other places. And there are a lot of people in the Arctic, in the Bering Sea area, who on both sides, both the Alaska natives and also in Chukotka in Russia, that have whaling cultures based around mostly bowhead whales and sometimes gray whales. So slightly different because the bowhead whales are only in the Arctic, so they're not hunting the same creatures, but there is a similar whaling culture there. And then why whales sort of lost importance in Japan, I think is in part because most of the places that had been doing this kind of coastal whaling essentially went bankrupt. Like they stopped being able to catch whales in the late 19th century because there was a huge crash in whale populations in the middle of the 19th century, with American whalers harvesting tens of thousands of them per year. And so the numbers of whales migrating past Japan fell very rapidly. And so a lot of these whaling groups couldn't operate anymore because there weren't any whales swimming past. And so some of them shifted to dolphins or, smaller animals. Some of them shifted to Antarctic whaling, but that's very far away from Japan. So most people living in Japan are not, dealing with Antarctic whaling. They might have the meat show up in school lunches and fancy restaurants, but it's not right there on the coast, right? And so I think that shift in where the whales are really made it hard for them to be as visible and therefore as much a part of Japanese culture. So
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Mio and Jakobina for the answer. I guess it's time to wrap up our today's lecture. I don't know if Davide has any final thoughts or Bina as well.
No, I thank you all participants as well, and of course thank you Jakobina and thank you Marco for inviting me. And yeah, I will be attending more of these
Ciao, Sonia.
meetings.
Yeah, please do feel free to do so. I think it was a very fruitful conversation, and I hope that this kind of connections might develop into something maybe in the near future. So many thanks again to Jakobina Arch, who has been so kind to log in at 8:30 in the morning on the Pacific coast of the United States, and thanks also to our audience, who has been so patient as to stay connected until 7 p.m. here in Italy or in Europe. Yeah, but it's good. It's good sometimes. Sorry to having woke you up so early in the morning, but okay. It was a very nice, very, very nice lecture today, and I thank you so much again on behalf of my department and of course also on the new institute. I thank you all, and I guess I'll see you around again soon. Of course, Jakobina, you're invited, and we're looking forward to having you in flesh, in person. In Venice, maybe.
Yes, I hope so. At some point, when things settle down, I would love to be able to make it to Europe finally. So, thank you very much for the invitation and the great conversations. And this was fun.
Thanks.
Thanks again.
See you soon. Bye.
See you soon.
And thank you, Marco, for organizing. Cheers.
Stay in touch. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.